Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon.
Allowing for a few minutes until everybody joins the webinar, and then we start. So give us one more minute before we start. One more minute. Very prompt audience we have today. I shouldn't be saying hello to specific people, but Ula, so lovely to see you here. It surely has been long. Excellent. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Few words before we start and before I introduce Emma, congratulations to all of us. The peace treaty has finally been reached, and hopefully calmness and no more uncertainties and lack of clarity will any one of us have to live with, which basically means that the coming 2, 3 months are extremely crucial for everything to do with revenue optimization. And nothing better talking about revenue optimization than starting with data. And that's what today's session is all about. So today's session really sits at the heart of where our industry is heading. And our speaker has definitely lived it on both sides, from the data science part and from a hotel operation. Emma began her career where so many of us is currently sitting or have sat in the past, revenue management, starting with MGM Resorts and working with data, needing answers, and really understanding firsthand the pressure of making the right call with imperfect data and information. We all can sigh to that statement. After the hotel operational experience, she crossed to the other side building the tool itself. She moved to ZS Associates, and Emma there developed AI-powered forecasting, dynamic pricing, digital personalization, and intelligent process automation deployed across major airlines, hotel companies, and restaurants. She is surely someone who truly understands both the question and the answer. Before we move into today's session, just some housekeeping reminders, housekeeping notes about our Q&A. Yes, you are in a webinar session, but you can at any time raise your hand and Justine will activate both your audio visual, and you can ask a question anytime throughout the webinar. You can ask your question directly to Emma. Alternatively, you can send me your question on the Q&A. Don't use the chat. I always look only on the Q&A, but anyway, you can send it anywhere you want. But send me the question on the Q&A, and I, as the voice of God of Emma, will ask Emma the question on your behalf. We don't like to keep Q&A towards the end. Let's have this as highly engaged two-way conversation as possible. So feel free to ask a question at any time throughout this 40 to 45-minute webinar. We ended, as usual, with a quick feedback because we want to hear your feedback about today's session. And most important afterwards is we will announce the last 2 sessions that are planned in our webinar series, because our last webinar series will end on the 1st of July. And guess what? Starting from today, next week on the 27th and the 1st of July, It is all about revenue management, revenue optimization, data optimization. So the three topics are super related and I think extremely beneficial to the phase that we are all going to enter in, which is called peace. As if we didn't have peace, but I mean, politically speaking, the peace that the leaders wants to know. So with that said, I say, Emma, over to you. I will now move to being your voice of God, and you will only hear my voice and see my face towards the end. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and very nice to meet you all, and great to be here today. Good afternoon. As Mona said, my name is Emma Scher. I'm based in Denver, Colorado, here in the US, and I've spent about the last decade building out data science and AI solutions, specifically for hotels, restaurants, and airlines. I really decided to focus in on this after being in the business and seeing firsthand both that the data is present, but not always available to solve the problems that are currently present and that really need to be solved. I also know what it feels like to be handed a tool that doesn't necessarily match the problem that needs to be solved, but also have gotten to learn and build out the experience of what it takes to build something that does solve the right problem. So that's really what we're going to be focusing on today. I know that there have been incredible presentations in the past few weeks about both AI, specific tools, about optimization. So what I really want to focus on today was the growing pressure to be able to roll out new solutions to solve new problems, but specifically how to do it in the right way. So before we get started with any kind of content or how do you start building the right things, I want to first start and get a gut check of kind of where everyone is as of today. No right answers and no judgment about the answers, more so wanted to understand your experience. So first wanted to understand, and feel free to drop it in the chat, in the last, let's say, year or two, have you seen within your organization any new data or AI initiatives? If not, no problem. Feel free to drop a one. If you have seen one or more of these initiatives, how did you see it go? If there's multiple, feel free to pick the biggest or the most impactful from your perspective. Did you see that it went through all the way to production? It's running, it's helping make decisions today. Or at this point, it might have been tested, worked, and fallen off the boat afterwards. Curious what everyone's experience has been so far. Feel free to take a minute to just drop in the chat. One, if you haven't been seeing new initiatives, or two or three, if you have, based on which direction it went in. Looking into Q&A. Chat has been disabled. Okay, I'm seeing it in Q&A. I'm seeing ones. We were seeing twos. Combinations of ones and twos. Love seeing that there's twos happening. Threes are understandable. Just to be clear, I've watched all three of these happen regularly, daily, weekly, so no judgment here. So it looks like there's a good combination of the three. What I really wanted to talk about today was to understand and start going through why this tends to actually happen and how you can avoid falling in this bucket of the threes to make sure that where you decide to take your bets, where you decide to move forward in terms of data and technology, how you can maximize the likelihood of success of that initiative itself. So I recognize that the pressure on hotel commercial teams right now is very, very real, both to fill the gap in terms of occupancy and RevPAR, but also to take advantage of the newest, greatest technology that's out there. It might be a new platform, a new dashboard, a new vendor likely in your inboxes most weeks. And it's a lot of information to process, and it seems like a lot of great opportunity to go after, and it really can be. But a lot of these efforts ultimately tend to stall before they can produce anything useful. Not because the technology was wrong, but because the organization wasn't ready for it in ways that didn't have a lot to do with the technology. So here's what I want you to take away from today. The things that make data and AI initiatives successful are not that mysterious, and they're not that expensive to put in place typically. Usually, they don't require new tools or solutions, they require clarity. And that's what we're going to dig into today. Three things that separate the initiatives that land from the ones that don't, and how to get ahead of them so that as you start making these bets, as you start developing, you maximize the chance that this makes the impact that you hope for. So the organizations that get this right are not typically special. What I hear frequently is the fact that this organization can do it because they have a larger budget, or this organization has better vendors or a better data engineering team. But I actually find that there's a few things that these organizations typically do before the technology ever came into play. Because AI doesn't necessarily fix misaligned teams or fix the data itself that already doesn't have trust. And therefore, when you go and roll out initiatives or different solutions on top of it, you're really expanding and building on some of those core foundational challenges. There was actually recently an MIT research paper that came out, and ultimately on the right, what I'm looking at is this 5%. So if we look at the light blue of, let's say, just like task specific Gen AI, really what we're talking about is trying to solve a very specific problem with a very specific technical solution. They're saying that 60% of the opportunities that were found and looked into, 20% ultimately were piloted. We see great pilot rates of really trying out and seeing if you can solve a problem. What I want to call out though is this drop off to 5% successfully implemented, because you can have the best idea. You can even roll it out and see it solve a problem in isolation. But the challenge is when you go to the broader organization. Let me come back here for one moment. There are tangible, predictable, and typically pattern-based reasons that data efforts haven't stuck historically. And it's really the same reasons that AI is not sticking today as it has been with data efforts historically. It almost always comes back to one of three things. The teams haven't agreed on what they're trying to accomplish. There's data that people are having trouble trusting, or the investment goes towards the wrong problem. But the good news is that all three of these things you can get ahead of before you either continue to spend or decide to spend on a specific solution or technology. And that's what makes them ultimately worth talking about. So, the very first learning, yes, I see a question coming through. Ella? Let me see if there's a question in chat. If not, feel free to come off of mute and go ahead and ask your question.
Ilham, do you have a question? Because your hand is raised. If you do not have a question, so drop down your hand, basically. Let's see, Sarah. Sarah, do you have a question?
Thank you.
Hi,
Thank you
Sarah.
so much.
You have a question. Go ahead and ask Emma.
Thank you.
Okay, so what's your question? Sarah?
Hi,
Okay.
can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, how are you? No, I don't have any questions. Sorry.
Oh, okay, so please put your hand down then, because your hand is still
Oh,
raised. So we think you have a
okay.
question.
Oh, sorry
Okay,
for that.
go ahead, Emma.
You've got it. So the first of the three big learnings that I've been able to capture over time, this one probably seems very obvious, but it's making sure that you're aligned on an outcome or the definition of success. So ultimately, teams often will start building before they've agreed on what success actually looks like. Simon Sinek actually built a whole framework all about starting with why, which I highly recommend. And it applies here more directly than a lot of places, actually. Because the reason that most data initiatives lose trust before they gain traction is not the data quality and it's not the tooling or the team typically. It's that different people had different answers to why this was being built in the first place. Different functions have genuinely different definitions of specific KPIs. Different leaders have different goals they're optimizing for. And nobody surfaces these points until the tool is already being built and people start asking questions that it wasn't designed to answer. The result is a solution that technically gets delivered, but nobody trusts or uses it because it wasn't built for a shared outcome. It was built for whoever had the loudest voice when designing or planning it up front. And this plays out in a few really recognizable and predictable and consistent ways. This might look like management and marketing looking at ADR, but getting completely different numbers from different systems, but not necessarily knowing why. This could be a dashboard that gets built for a commercial team, but the GM is still making decisions off of a completely different report because that initial aggregation and centralization didn't happen. Or an AI forecasting tool that gets deployed, but then the frontline managers override it every single day or week. Not necessarily because it's wrong, but because nobody aligned on what it was supposed to optimize for or provide the visibility that the actual users needed. In each case, the issue isn't necessarily the tool, It's the why that was never actually settled up front. This is also why so many pilots work and then rollouts end up failing. The pilot was scoped for one person, one team, one part of the problem that was very clearly defined. But then a rollout will hit a whole organization that never agreed on that one question or that that was the right problem to solve. Getting that alignment in place before you build is one of the highest leverage things a commercial team can do. There are definitely some KPIs, more than others, that tend to lead to misalignment. On the surface, everybody can agree what RevPAR is, the intersection of ADR and occupancy. That should be the North Star metric for hotels. And the questions come into play when you have questions like, what do renovations or out of order rooms, how do those get handled? Or what about cancellations? Cancellations weren't filled, so we should take them. But then who gets penalized? It's not a matter of having one perfect answer. It's a matter of the fact that for a specific situation, a specific use case, a specific application, getting alignment amongst everyone about what things truly mean, what the source of truth is, and how you should proceed is so critical to making sure that you're solving the right problem in the right way for the right people, which can look different in different situations. If you've seen that one KPI in particular has been especially challenging, feel free to drop it in the chat. What we can also do is come back to see if there's commonalities amongst all of them. The one most frequently I see is certainly RevPAR, skewing towards occupancy though, because the question is, what is inventory? Again, these are core foundational questions. However, without that alignment before getting started, it can lead to a lot of confusion because the definition of success actually changes. We might all agree that we want to increase RevPAR, but the question is how? And how do we know if we actually did it successfully? So, what does getting this right look like? Because it's not just about doom and gloom about the fact that we don't know how to do it or that things will fail. These are preventable things. So, getting it right looks like these three specific things before building. One, what are we trying to improve? And who needs to be able to trust what we build and use it on a daily basis? Number two, when we're talking about being able to use it on a daily basis, this is not just knowing that revenue managers will be the end users, but meeting with them and understanding how do they use these systems? What decisions are they making? Because the builders are not necessarily those that are going to be using it, and making sure it will work for the people that have the decision power and have the ability to take action on what's being built is very, very critical, and they need to be part of the conversation. And number three is, what does success look like? As I mentioned, there's KPIs and agreeing on what we're trying to solve, but the other is before you start building, deciding what good looks like. For example, if you roll out a personalization problem or a personalization solution, good could look like the personalization program being rolled out, maybe personalized ancillary products. What if the answer instead was that success looks like an increase in ancillary sales? Technically, one should lead to the other. But the question is, how do you tie your actions, your analysis, your assumption of how things are going to the right KPI to make sure you're making traction? You can try and drive occupancy, but you don't want to drive occupancy at the cost of profit, for example. And therefore, making sure that your eye is on the prize and you have a clear North Star metric across everyone on a project or a team really is critical before you get started. And if you're having conversations and find that you're getting inconsistent answers to these three for a project, it's best to pause, get alignment on these pieces, and then dive in because you'll know that everyone is ultimately aligned on what you're trying to accomplish. The second learning is making sure that you're ready to build, which might seem kind of similar to the first one, but I do find them very different. The reason is because there's three specific things that need to be in place in order to build successfully. And when I say build, this could be build, it could be buy, it could be integrate, it could be change, it could be pivot. Really, we're talking about putting effort, investment, time towards a specific change and making sure you're ready to do so. Really, this is more broadly applicable than just within like the data and AI space. Technical solutions overall, I find really are valuable when you come back to these core aspects. So when we're looking at examples of what it looks like when the foundation is not here, because especially within the hotel industry, there's a few common ways that this looks like. One, for example, is that a team launches an initiative and then it immediately hits the wall. Let's say you do a personalization initiative on your website. You want to add a chatbot onto your website to assist with bookings. Very common, very useful. People don't want to pick up the phone and call as frequently anymore. But the challenge is, this seems like a great initiative. It could make a lot of money. It could drive a lot of conversion and make customers happy. But you should start with making sure that your website can connect to your reservation system. Because if there's a clear understanding that a person wants to book a reservation for next Friday, without the ability to take action on it and book that reservation, this ends up becoming no longer feasible. Or a second one is that you create a recommendation system, but it's built on top of data that hasn't been updated in 2 years. And so the output looks confident and it looks good, but it's also wrong. In each of these cases, the idea is right. The foundation just wasn't necessarily ready to build on top of. And the best models that the world is running on as of right now, as even if you have the best possible model, if you're running it on stale, incomplete, or dirty data, you're still going to get bad answers, just faster and with more confidence attached, which in my opinion could even be worse than no answers at all. I'm not saying don't go into data. I'm not saying don't go into those analysis, but do take a moment to understand where these insights are coming from, because strong insights on top of bad data could be misleading, and therefore making sure you understand what you're seeing, what you have that's actionable, and then going from there. And it's not just about whether you have data. Most of you on this call more than likely have more data than you know what to do with, and more data than is actually needed. So actually, from my perspective, it's about whether the data that you have is in a form that your team can act on. And that is genuinely one of the most solvable gaps that there is once you know where to look. The shift I'd encourage is not saying my data needs to be perfect and clean and centralized and all of this before I get started with any data initiatives. That's certainly not what I'm recommending. But instead, when you start solving a problem, when you start looking into a solution, one of the first questions that you should ask is, what is the minimum viable data that's required for this specific solution? If you're working with vendors, internal data engineers, consultants, ask this question. Because before you dive into a year-long integration, making sure you have the data that's required to successfully execute on it is so important, but also will save you so much headache down the line by preventing the surprises of knowing that you don't have a key critical piece of data to solve for this, or that you have some of the key data to move this along much more quickly. It's worth having this quick conversation because ultimately it can surface a lot of the future pain points and get ahead of it. Outside of data, it's not just about the data for data solutions. People focus mostly on the data side of, do I have the data? Is the data clean? The other two, I would argue, are just as important, and the two that are more frequently overlooked, especially on the people side. We talked about data. Do you have what the solution requires? But from a system perspective, the question is, do the existing platforms connect in a way that makes what you want to build possible? Like I mentioned, when you have a chatbot on a website, there's lots of requests coming in to build a custom brand aligned chat interface for users on the website to assist with Q&A, to assist with check-in, to assist with reservation adjustments. This makes sense. This can be a great user experience. But again, the systems need to be in place to make sure that the website can talk to reservation systems, to make sure that this agent actually has access to user information, which can cause challenges from a PII perspective. All of these are solvable. It just requires that conversation to really determine the best way to build it out and to see if there's any firm blockers that are going to make it so that you don't build out half and then realize that this actually isn't actionable, which ties into this third point, people. People are often viewed when it comes to data and technology solutions as just a cog in this machine or a user. I view it very, very differently. One, because especially within the hotel industry where there is such an importance to both service, personalization, user experience, knowing when to have a human in the loop is critical. This is not about replacing folks within the hotel industry with AI or with data, but instead empowering them with the right solutions, with the right information to do their jobs better. Therefore, the solution needs to align to people, but also you need the people to support a solution. An example I see frequently is rolling out a very technical data solution or data product, and then realizing that once the consultants or vendors leave, that there's nobody that's data informed enough internally to maintain that solution, to actually help guide people to use the solution. Someone who's responsible for making sure not just that the model runs, but that people are using the output appropriately and taking action on it. This might seem like a lot in terms of, oh, I need all of this ready in order to get started, but it could be really simple. If you're thinking about creating a new, let's say, flash report, just a daily report about performance and automate that, you still want to make sure that you know what data should be pulled from, where it should be pulled from, how it should be shown based on the user. System-wise, you want to make sure that's going to people in the right forum. Is it going by email? Is it getting dropped into a folder? People know who you're sending it to, because that flash report will likely look very different for a front desk employee versus a revenue manager versus an executive. Again, it's about looking holistically at what you're solving, not just pinpoint view of exactly the solution and focusing on the technology, but really coming back to the why. I saw a question come through in the Q&A. I did not see a hand up, so just feel free to let me know if you have any additional questions, but for now, I'll keep on going. To the last point in terms of the third learning, solving the right problem. Again, we want to maximize RevPAR. That's the problem, right? We want to get a lot more specific than that. And this one can be challenging because this doesn't feel like a problem when it's happening. It actually feels like momentum. It feels like success. It feels like progress. Teams typically invest in what's exciting, what's visible, and what's high profile. Right now, that might look like chatbots. It might look like personalization. It might look like AI-powered demand forecasting. While simpler, high value, very achievable work goes unaddressed. And I want to be clear that I spend most of my time building these complex, sophisticated solutions for organizations just like yours. That is what I spend most of my time doing. And slash, but what I consistently see is that organizations that get the most out of those sophisticated solutions are the ones that did the foundational work first, not just as a consolation prize, but because the foundational work actually generates both real returns on its own and sets organizations up to dramatically for better inputs for those more sophisticated solutions. If bad information in means bad information out, that also means that stronger input, stronger alignment on how to use your data and how your organization runs means an even more actionable and clear roadmap of exactly how you get there. Mona?
I have a question from the audience for you. Tamer
Yes.
is asking, in your experience, do you think that the biggest barrier to successful hotels analytical technology would be data quality or organizational culture?
I would say organizational culture. And the reason that I say that with such confidence is because you can have the cleanest possible data. And I've gone through large data cleansing centralization initiatives. You can do all of that and still not solve any problem. I would say that, and if I'm remembering correctly, the question is is it stalling because of data quality or because of culture? From my
Mhm.
perspective, with perfect quality, you still will not be able to move the progress forward if you don't have the culture in place. With the right culture in place, you can make the data happen. It goes back to that MVP concept. When I go into an organization, frequently they'll say, I don't think I have the data to build out a personalization program or to build a digital ancillary optimization engine. That might be true in terms of the data not being clean enough, but it doesn't mean that you need to have a massive initiative to cleanse all of your data, centralize everything, remove any duplication or redundancy in order to get started. I think from my perspective, the culture change allows for an organization to first say, what is the problem I need to solve and what do I need to solve it? Because from that point, it might become clear that data quality or data cleansing in a specific area is needed, or that there's specific actions that need to be taken in order to be able to accomplish this. When you start with culture, though, you get that kind of laser pointed vision of how do I accomplish this goal, including considering data quality. But if you just focus on data quality, you'll end up with cleaner data, which is great, but you still need it to be actionable, which really comes back to the culture. So from my perspective, starting with the culture ends up leading to better data quality because there's a better shared understanding of what data means, how you're supposed to be using it, and also what you're trying to accomplish. Even with data issues, data gaps, those should not be blockers, especially within the hotel industry. There are so many legacy systems that are outside of our control. We can't change how data is generated from Opera, for example, or from your RMS or from your PMS. But what you can do is say, how can we as an organization work together to make the most value from this? Part of that could be cleansing, but starting with the culture allows you to make bets in the right areas and then plan accordingly. Hope that helps answer the question, though.
Tamer, was your question answered? Well, I'm sure Tamer will send me in the Q&A. Thank you very much, Emma.
Of course. So once you start thinking through going through the foundational work that's required to be able to start accomplishing some of this work, it allows you to also pivot from just bets that could be made or solutions that could be deployed instead to a more actionable roadmap rather than more disconnected bets. Because when you understand that foundation A then enables solution B, which then leads to the fancy solution C that everyone has their eyes on, it makes it easier to understand why you go through A and B first to get to C, even though C is the main topic of conversations. Because AI projects are large and visible and require a significant amount of investment, there's even more pressure to pick the impressive problem over the impactful one. And the answer is not always to start with the basics or to start with like a boring use case. Instead, what I'm proposing is to slow down and look at the full landscape of options before committing to one use case or solution. Because it might not be the shiniest, but it might be the right one for you and your organization. If you think about an RFP process for vetting group sales, this is a process that I find to be extremely time consuming for most hotels, typically a pretty inconsistent process in terms of commercial teams and how they handle RFPs. And one that, from my perspective, could be improved pretty dramatically with a relatively simple data and automation layer. That's not a small opportunity, both in dollar signs nor in terms of organizational change. It is a very high value problem with a clear path to solving it, using data that most hotels likely already have. But it's also one that often gets overlooked. A concrete example from my own career was a project that got completely deprioritized because it was considered too small and likely not impactful. My manager gave me the green light to pursue it alongside my other work because I saw impact there. I saw the potential there. It was price optimization on literally cabanas at a pool. The pools for the hotels, just the cabanas and the chairs at the hotels. The very first year, we added several millions of dollars in incremental revenue. That was a surprise to everybody. But that's the pattern that comes up really constantly, is that the overlooked problems with really clear solutions and a very high potential return are often overlooked, even though those can actually be the highest value opportunities for everybody. So here's the question that's worth bringing to your next planning conversation or internal leadership discussion. What would it look like if our next initiative was one that stuck, that made it to production, that the teams trusted, that generated a return you could point to? What would be needed for that to be true? Because ultimately, when you're looking at a laundry list of potential things you could deploy, could integrate, could build, could solve, being able to balance the value something is generated from the feasibility of being able to roll it out will allow for everyone to be able to focus in on what success can really look like and where it's worth putting your eggs in that specific basket. This kind of balance definitely helps here. This is a big part of a lot of my conversations with organizations, is determining, is something feasible and is it worth doing? Return on investment, or ROI, in the world of data and AI can be tricky because you don't know what things will look like and you don't know what the impact could be. But there are ways to be able to really understand and model with the business, what can I expect to happen? The reason I felt confident about those cabanas was because I had done an analysis that when prices were changed slightly, that there was a massive reaction in terms of the actual demand from users. People were still willing to buy, and if it was a holiday weekend in the summer, people are more likely to go and actually buy these. Similarly, I find that these two questions typically are a really good starting point when you're trying to think, with all of the possible options, where do I start? Number one is, what are the necessary things in our operation that are harder than they should be? Whenever I'm thinking it shouldn't be this hard, typically that's a really good indicator that there's an opportunity to improve it. Sometimes it truly just needs to be that manual, but frequently when things are either very repetitive, very manual, based on gut feeling, these pieces end up being more time consuming than they need to be, and often are a good place to look at, how do I solve this problem? Not what solution can I put on top of this, but what is the core problem here that potentially could be either completely fixed or helped through some of these specific technologies or solutions. And the second one is, what is the highest value problem we could actually solve with what we already have? Again, this seems obvious of maximize occupancy, maximize RevPAR, but I'd encourage folks to get more specific, because when you think about an airline, for example, what is the highest value problem? You can break this out into getting more people to book, but if you've maxed that out, how do you get people to spend more on ancillaries? How do you get people to stay on property for dining? Really, what you're thinking about is positioning and repositioning how you view your business to being able to view it from the lens of what is able to be made even better, even more impactful, and scale the differences and the unique factors of your property by using these solutions, not just by automating them. So this is not all about what goes wrong. I want to give you all a guide on exactly what this looks like when things go right and how you can do it. Because when they do, it changes everything about how data and AI initiatives land within an organization. And I genuinely believe that this is within reach for everyone that's within this room. The organizations that I see get this right across airlines, hotel companies, restaurant groups, it's not just limited to hospitality either. They didn't get it right because they had a bigger budget or better vendors. They got there because they built the right habits to support the technology that they were building and growing. They agreed on a small number of data questions that mattered before they picked any tools. And they had someone whose job it was to own the data on an ongoing basis, not just use it when it's convenient, but own it as a sustained responsibility. They solved the right problem first, not just the most impressive ones. Clean data, a shared source of truth, and a team that trusted the numbers. And that's what they built on top of. That's what I see being kind of those core aspects of building onto success. Because when AI came into the picture for these kinds of organizations, it worked far more frequently because the team trusted the output because the data behind it was clean. The recommendations mapped to decisions that were actually able to be actioned on. And there was someone accountable for what happened next. Again, not just make sure that it ran or that the model's running, but what did the team do with those answers? It's not magic, but it's more about discipline applied in the right order. And it's something that every team is capable of. Excuse me. So again, you don't need a magic solution to start moving on this. You need to start having the right conversations. And I want to leave you with 3 ideas of specific conversations that you can actually start having today to start moving you in this direction of understanding your data, understanding your organizational capabilities when it comes to these areas, and start moving you towards a point of readiness so that when you're ready for your next data or AI initiative, the likelihood of it being both successful, sticky, and exciting for your employees is way, way higher. So these are the 3 questions I'd start with. Number 1, for your commercial teams. If I sat down with revenue, marketing, and sales right now and asked them to define one of our top KPIs, maybe it's like RevPAR, the question is, would you get the same answer from all of them? The goal here is to understand the level of alignment, both in terms of how you're looking at the problem statement, but also the data itself. Because with those core misalignments, it makes it hard to keep an eye on a communal prize that you all are able to collaboratively work towards together. The next one is to ask before your next big investment. Do we have the data, the systems, and the people in place that will support this even 12 months after launch, not just when you first go live. Without that, with that, you're able to set your team up for success to make sure that this will not just launch at or work at launch, but also that this will be a sustained impact over time, growing with the business. Businesses are changing, they're expecting to change. How do you make sure that your tools keep up with it? And the third one is to start with your team itself. What is the highest value problem that we could solve with what we already have? Asking your teams, asking people that are in the weeds, both of decision making and the data, often will arise ideas and problems that are so foundational that one, like I said, they'll provide so much value by solving them themselves directly, but also create that core, stronger foundation to build on. So you can create a strategic roadmap of what data and AI can look like in your organization in a sustainable and scalable manner. With all of these conversations under your belt, your team should be set up to design a data and AI roadmap that's built to last. One where initiatives make it to production, earn your team's trust, and generate returns that you can actually build on. And that's the goal. It's closer than it might think, or closer than it might feel right now. And with so much noise and information around what can be done in the AI space and in the data space, I hope that this is both empowering and encouraging that all of it is right within your fingertips. Setting your teams up for success to be able to tackle these changes, roll out these new innovations, and be able to make a change is one of the biggest areas that's worth investing both time and money into right now. So with that, I'd love to pause, see if there's any additional questions, and pass it back to Mona if she has any additional pieces to share. This also was just one kind of high-level overview of how to really move into the data and AI space with confidence, both individually and organizationally. There's also a full course available called the Hotel Data Analytics Essentials. This moves into, once you feel confident with some of these core foundational pieces, how do you get in there and actually feel confident about the data? How do you start answering questions? How do you start moving towards a data-ready environment and start actually solving these problems hands-on in a tactical fashion? So wanted to add that call out in case folks are interested in more content in a similar capacity, which I was able to create alongside Kelly McGuire here with HSMAI. So with that, I'm happy to pass it back to Mona and go through any questions that might have been raised throughout the conversation.
Thank you, Emma. Before the question,
Yes.
is that, Gerastine, is that the QR code for, Gerastine is going to drop in the chat the link to the full course, which was launched last year by HSMAI globally, which is called Hotel Data Analytics, co-created by Dr. Kelly and Emma. A question for you, Emma, from the audience. Which data analysis techniques are most effective in identifying booking patterns and improving hotel forecasting accuracy for occupancy and ADR?
Interesting. I would say that it's probably not going to be news to a lot of people on this call. I will explain the why though. Booking curves, and for those of you that are not in the revenue management space, when I'm talking about a booking curve, it's how did that occupancy come to be? So you look at how prices changed and you look at how bookings have changed accordingly. From my perspective, this is one of the core aspects that's frequently overlooked when it comes to those booking patterns or demand patterns for forecasting for any kind of predictive analytics. The reason that I say that is because understanding not just demand patterns in terms of like what days are most popular, what room types are most popular, why are people booking. The aspect that I find to be really important and frequently overlooked is how you actually get there or the buildup over time. When it comes to looking at immediate, like hands-on just analysis of booking curves, from my perspective, understanding what happens 6 months before, 3 months before, 2 months before, 1 month before, 3 weeks before, 2 weeks before, 1 week before, 5, 34, 5, 32, 1 days before, understanding how user behavior changes over time, not just for that hotel, not just for that room type, but over time based on both urgency, based on how general demand changes. I find that really leaning into the booking and pricing curves and how they're related tends to show a lot more than just zooming in by day. So often what I've seen is that hotels will look at by day, let's say pickup. What has been, what is the current occupancy for each day in the next month? Valid way to look at it. If there's still a ton that's left to sell, lower your price. Logical thought process. What's missed, though, is being able to really understand and take a step back to say, if I know that most bookings come in 2 weeks out, I shouldn't overreact a month before. So I know your question was mostly about what analytical approach is best for understanding bookings and demand patterns, but I would say that's less about the approach you take and more about what you look at within the data. And I would argue that looking at things both over time and from a customer lens are very important outside of the standard, let's say, segment or by date. Makes it a little bit more challenging because it kind of creates a grid, as you would imagine, of every day, but also how far ahead of time. But when you look at it from that lens, it becomes easier to understand why are people taking the action they're taking? Why should I lower my price? And should I expect any change to come from it? So that's one of the big ways that I like to lean into analytics, regardless of the analytical approach I'm using, to make sure that the data I'm looking at is giving a holistic picture.
Thank you, Emma. One more question for you. Hi, Emma. Great presentation. In your opinion, thank you, Dan. In your opinion, who within the organization or possibly outside bears accountability for everything you've presented today? Is it an executive team, a sponsor, internal data analytics team, end users of the solution, third-party tech partners, or some combination of the above, and or anyone else? If more than one individual group, what's the best way to enable the right collaboration? Very interesting question.
I love this question because so frequently I see it given to the wrong person. And then people realize that it was the wrong person after it was rolled out. My opinion on this is that it partially depends on the solution, but in general, I think that my opinion holds here. Who you want responsible for this, it's going to be a collaborative effort across multiple different people. However, it is so important to have one person that is accountable for this specific initiative. When I say accountable, this does not mean that they are the person building the whole thing, and it definitely does not mean that they are the person that has to pay for it. But what this person is responsible for is two things, which often lead to where projects go awry. One is defining and ensuring complete alignment on what you're actually solving for. So what is the actual problem statement? What are you expecting to happen, and what does success look like? That person is responsible for making sure that there is full buy-in and that the people that need to be aware are in that conversation. The other angle of it, though, is understanding the technical aspect of it. Because I find that typically when you're deciding who is the, like, let's say, person that's accountable for that whole project or that whole initiative, if you put someone that's only on the business side on it, they lose sight of the technical nuance that's required to actually make it happen, those feasibility aspects or the how it should be done. But if you're only on the technical side, frequently you'll solve the wrong problems, such as optimizing for sales. But when you say sales, it's units of sales, and therefore you end up not making more money. So from my perspective, there isn't a right person in an organization, as opposed to the fact that that role needs to be filled by someone or people that can play the role of having alignment of what you're solving and what the goal is, because there's nothing worse than rolling something out and having it be successful than people deciding, just kidding, it wasn't actually successful because we didn't define success. There's nothing worse. But the other is by making sure that there's that technical depth, which is dependent on the specific project, on how technical it needs to be. It ensures that you can get the technical buy-in too, because this person needs to make sure they bring in the right people to the conversation so it's not happening in a silo, but also ensures the broader project or solution success. So I would say it's okay to be shared. It shouldn't be, let's say, a third-party tech partner, because ultimately you want someone that understands how your business works, how your technology works, and what's really needed to guide that conversation with the third-party tech partners. Typically, my role in organizations when I go in as a consultant frequently is to try and create this role or create this clarity to bridge the gap between the teams. Silos between business and technology are not new and they're not going anywhere, but being very intentional with bridging that gap to make sure the right people are in the room are far more important than having the most senior person or the most perfect profile to solve all of the questions versus acting like the glue between all of them. Hope that helps answer your question, Dan. It can change over time, but everyone should know who that person is. And everyone should know what that person's role is, because they can then delegate out to everybody else to make sure that it keeps moving in the right direction.
Thank you, Emma. I have more questions for you.
Yeah.
How
So
does
what
a
is clean
clean
data?
data look like?
I love this. From my perspective, clean data means understandable, predictable, and usable. Notice that none of this says error-free. The reason that I say this is because I believe that there's no one definition of clean data. Really good example is renovations at a hotel, which I know were a thorn in my side at several different hotel companies that I've worked with. Because the question is, if half of your hotel is out of order for renovation, does it count against RevPAR? And so the question is, what is clean data? Clean data, from my perspective, means you know what you're looking at. That could mean a data dictionary of literally a definition of the fields. It could mean consensus around how you're supposed to use that data. There's not going to be one super query that works for everyone in an organization. That's not the end goal, as opposed to saying, in what situation should I look at A versus B? And so, from my perspective, clean data really looks at how do you make all of your data available, easy to navigate and easy to understand for different kinds of users. Predictable, meaning that even if it's wrong, it's predictably wrong. Good example of this is you might get duplicate transactions. It happens. Sometimes it's because of an initial authorization versus settlement. That's predictable. That's expected. You can filter those out because you know what it actually represents. It's not dirtiness as opposed to not what you need. And again, the third piece of it is more so about the ability to action on it, because I've seen initiatives for years of just cleaning data, centralizing data, one source of truth. But then no one can do anything with it, because then you have one gigantic data set that's not usable, not connected where it needs to be, and it doesn't live in the systems that it needs to live in. So from my perspective, clean data is more about the general status of the data and usability of the data, as opposed to saying there should be no, like, a lot of people will answer with, there should be no duplicates. You should have, let's say, a very clear unique key for a specific table. You should have repos that aren't reading from each other. There's the technical answer, but from my perspective, it's way more important to focus on those three other aspects and then back into, therefore, what hands-on cleansing needs to be done.
Thank you, Emma. I still have one more question for you. Um, Great explanation on the ROI part, since it usually takes time to show it, but with high turnover and lack of organizational culture, what would be the warning signs or alarms that the analytic initiatives is failing before the management realize it, or how could this be avoided?
I love that question, because oftentimes people wait until it's too late or until something has like fully failed, to acknowledge that that's happening. I love this question because it's about how do you get ahead of it. From my perspective, three things. Part of the reason that defining success up front before building is so uncomfortable is because it creates really rigid accountability, which I personally love, because there's no ambiguity there. You know if something's working or not. That also means being able to define what success looks like at different phases of a project. For example, if I was building out a set of dashboards for executives, my success should not be based on if the decisions that the executives are making based on that dashboard lead to more money, right? Because there's like 45 things that have to happen between me building this dashboard and then them making money based on it. So what I like to do is create more incremental or like a holistic view of impact, or what should be happening or what shouldn't be happening. For example, when I think of like an analytics project and whether or not it's failing, things that I would look for in the initial rollout: one, explicit feedback. Ask for feedback. Don't wait for people to say that there's a problem. Ask them if it's working. Number two is visibility. When you set up a new project, a new initiative, a new anything, consider whether or not you'll actually be able to know if it's working. So, for example, a dashboard, anytime I roll out any kind of new dashboards, reporting, anything like that, I try and put in logging to know, are people actually using it? Who's using it? Because again, if you have one person that's using it 100 times a day versus 100 people using it once a day, those are different stories. So understanding how it's being used and why it's being used will allow you to understand if it's actually meeting its intended goal way earlier. And the third one is checking in. Again, a lot of times I find that organizations don't want to do this part of it because of the fact that it creates the opportunity to say, no, this actually failed. It's a really uncomfortable aspect of this. But I think especially within the data and AI space and how much easier it is to actually roll out new solutions, solve new problems, excuse me, it's even more important to fail fast and learn fast. I'm a big believer in failing fast. In general, I'm a perfectionist, but here's the thing. If you're going to do an initiative, you're going to spend $100,000 on an initiative to roll out reporting, and it's not going to go anywhere. Would you rather spend $100,000 in 2 weeks or $100,000 in a year for it to then be canceled? I'd rather spend $100,000 in 2 weeks, know, and then be able to plan accordingly. And so it's about having the uncomfortable conversations about what success looks like, also what failure can look like, and then giving permission and having alignment that doing the best thing for the organization is what should be done. Not, we already invested in this project, therefore we should see it to fruition. We've already rolled out personalization, and therefore we have to make it work, even though it's hurting customer experience. All of these pieces are about creating that holistic view and giving permission to be really critical about what's working as opposed to optimistic. I am one to be optimistic about everything and the impact things can make. I'll create that both conservative and really optimistic view of what can happen, but plan for both. Plan for that big impact, also plan for what happens if it doesn't, and don't take it as a binary fail or pass, as opposed to saying, if I know week one that this specific feature is hard for users to use, me knowing that, knowing it's not working, gives me the chance to fix it and be able to get this back on track. Maximizes your likelihood that you get to that endpoint you want without dealing with the sunk cost of continuing to deal with that ahead of time. Because sunk costs, I think, are something that is both very frequent and common, but it's also avoidable by having those hard conversations.